Undercover boss buys coffee and toast at food court cafe stops cold when waitress shares tips keep staff hungry. This morning, Michael Foster, 50 years old CEO and founder of the famous Sunrise Cafe chain, sat pensively in a corner of the food court cafe, a branch of the chain he had painstakingly built. The soft yellow light filtered through the glass panels, illuminating the steaming toast and the milk coffee on the table. Everything seemed so ordinary. The POS machine is beeping steadily. The occasional clink of a spoon against a cup, the scent of butter and coffee drifted through the air. Yet right in the middle of this familiar scene, something made Michael pause. He looked up and met the weary gaze of Lily, the young waitress whose hands trembled as she placed the tray of toast in front of him. Her eyes shone with an unspoken burden, her hands trembled as though holding all the fatigue of sleepless nights. In a moment of hesitation, she let out a simple confession. A confession that felt like a knife to his heart. Tips here are just enough to keep us hungry. Michael fell silent. Every word she spoke felt like a bitter drop falling into his cup of coffee. In that instant, memories of those early mornings came flooding back, mornings when he stood behind the toast counter, dividing each tip with the hands and heart of a founder. The employees' eyes are then as bright as stars, full of hope. But now Lily's eyes were tired, resigned, as if waiting for something she no longer dared to name. In the soft yellow light of the cafe, Michael realized just one sentence, yet it laid bare all the things he feared the most. That what he once proudly called the second home for employees might now only be an unfinished dream. Within the very cafe chain that Michael had built with all his passion and trust in fairness, tips, once a symbol of hope, had now become a blade cutting through the dreams of so many. A small change might reignite hope, but he knew he had to find that path himself. That morning, the first light of day streamed through the large glass windows of the food court cafe, a branch located in a bustling shopping center where laptops opened and milk coffees were ordered faster than size. Amid the busy scene, no one noticed the middle-aged man sitting quietly in a corner, his hand gently playing with a now cold cup of coffee. His eyes gathered every breath of the space. That man was Michael Foster, 50 years old, founder of the renowned food court cafe chain throughout the city. He had once placed all his trust and his heart into building this place as a second home for all young workers, a place where every drop of sweat shed would be repaid with kindness and fairness. Michael had always believed no one should have to worry about their next meal just because the tips were divided unfairly. Yet lately, rumors had crept in like cold winds, employees quitting en masse, customers complaining about the service, some saying tips were being skimmed off shamelessly. The big question hit him straight in the heart. Had the very home he had built with all his heart been turned by its managers into a place of injustice, where hope was smothered under the yellow light? And that was the reason this morning, Michael sat there, in a simple shirt concealing the powerful presence of a CEO. No one recognized him. He didn't need glory, didn't need fawning greetings. He needed the truth. And more than anything, he needed to know whether his dream was still being nurtured by the very people he once trusted. Every ray of sunlight quietly shone down on the toast counter, highlighting the glistening sugar crystals on the bread, as if trying to illuminate the trust that Michael Foster still hoped remained. But that light wasn't enough to erase the fatigue etched on Lily's face, the young waitress, thin figure, dark circles under her eyes, remnants of many sleepless nights. Michael noticed that she was always assigned the off-peak shifts when customers were few and tips were scarce. Yet she kept working diligently, her hand trembling as she carried the tray of toast to the table. The overhead yellow light illuminated the bead of sweat rolling down her cheek, like a scar that would never heal on a fragile heart. When Lily placed the hot toast in front of Michael, someone she still thought was just another guest, she lowered her head, her voice hoarse from exhaustion, trembling like the first raindrops of the season. Tips. Here. Just enough to keep us hungry. A sentence that seemed so ordinary, yet felt like a knife tearing through Michael's heart. His gaze froze. He had once believed, had once hoped, that every employee under the roof of Food Court Cafe shared equally in every drop of sweat and tears. But now, right in the place he had built, a young worker was whispering in despair about not having enough to eat. Even before those words had fully left Lily's lips, a janitor walked past his table. His eyes were as gray as early morning fog, his voice hoarse from fatigue, letting out a phrase drenched in bitterness. Here, the one who works the hardest is also the one who suffers the most. That sentence left Michael speechless. It was like a merciless verdict, laying bare the stark truth about Food Court Cafe, the place he had once proudly called the second home for all employees. The yellow light now only highlighted the sweat streaks, the tears that had fallen on the old wooden floor, leaving behind the marks of a dream of fairness being choked day by day. Michael sat silently in the corner of the cafe, the yellow light reflecting off the gray hairs on his head. His coffee had long gone cold, yet the bitterness lingered on his tongue, the bitterness of a truth slowly unfolding. He quietly observed every detail, every footstep across the tiled floor, every bead of sweat still clinging to the collars of those he had once called family. On the other side of the counter, Michael noticed a group of young staff uniforms, neatly pressed hair, perfectly styled, their demeanor confident. Their eyes shone with arrogance, as if every reward had already been decided. They moved through the cafe like those who had been hand-picked, given the prime shifts when tips flowed like water. The yellow light revealed the faint smiles on their lips, the smiles of those who knew the victory was already in their hands. Their eyes exchanged subtle looks, secret nods, the language that only those in the circle would understand. And Lily, the young girl who left Michael speechless with her words about not having enough to eat, continued quietly cleaning, collecting trays of toast, wiping the bar, and picking up every scrap of paper left by customers. Her hair was slicked with sweat, and the yellow light reflected in her tired eyes so intensely that it made Michael's heart ache. Every step she took was slow, her hands trembling, as if they were carrying a burden too heavy to name. Michael noticed that she was always assigned to the off-peak shifts when customers were few and tips were so scarce they couldn't even buy a decent dinner. Her eyes were lost, as if searching for an escape in a forest of injustice. He clenched his jaw, his hand gripping the table. His gaze stopped at the POS counter, where the pale green light from the computer screen cast a cold glow on the face of a young employee. The boy stood there, his hands deftly moving across the screen, his fingers dancing like a pianist. Michael heard the beep sound, once a proud symbol of transparency, but now it sounded like a blade cutting into his heart. He saw each tip amount appear and then disappear, as if that green light was devouring the sweat and tears of Lily and those like her. A surge of pain rose in him like a storm, washing away all hope. Michael remembered the early days, when he himself fairly distributed every single tip, when everyone's eyes shone like stars, the eyes of people who believed that with hard work, fairness would smile on them. He remembered every smile, every grateful look, every trembling hand accepting their first tips, as if receiving a glimmer of hope. But now Lily, that young girl, had changed. Her eyes were etched with fear and helplessness. Michael knew. She had bravely kept records of every tip that disappeared, every unfair shift assignment, every threatening message she hadn't dared to reveal. Those tiny sheets of paper, those trembling handwritten notes, were like silent screams from someone too afraid to speak up. Michael could picture her trembling hands as she wrote, her eyes darting around the cafe like a thief of light, fearing that any cold glance could snatch away the only place she had left. Michael took a deep breath. His breathing blended with the sighs of the young people who had once called this place their second home. He could hear his heartbeat, every beat a vow left unspoken. Did I really let this happen? The yellow light fell on his face, highlighting the crow's feet marks of the years of dedication, of the sleepless nights, building a fair and decent food court cafe. Michael knew this wasn't just a battle with a fraudulent POS, but a battle to regain the trust of the people who had once called this place home. He knew all it would take was one decision, just one click, to reignite the fire of trust he had once poured his heart into building. Under the yellow light that shone on the cold stainless steel tables, Michael sat motionless. His eyes were fixed on the cashier's counter. From afar, he could see the blurry tip amounts continuously flickering on the screen, numbers that seemed harmless, yet hid a dark story of exploitation and fraud. Each number that disappeared was like a teardrop from Lily, and employees like her tears that had not yet fallen but were swept away by the night of injustice. Michael felt a lump in his throat. He vividly remembered the early days when Food Court Cafe was just a small shop he and the first employees built together. Back then, every tip was shared equally, and every laugh behind the coffee counter was as warm as fire. Their eyes then shone bright like stars in the night sky, glistening with the belief that if they worked hard, fairness would always be on their side. But now that light had faded, replaced by the quiet resignation of those assigned to low-traffic shifts, forced to work during hours when no one paid attention, only to collect a handful of tips by day's end that couldn't even buy a decent meal. He watched more closely. Michael's eyes scanned every employee, every footstep that passed the bar. A few still smiled and laughed, exchanged discreet handshakes, with the managers traded glances at the POS, like secret codes that needed no words. He noticed those employees were always assigned to the high-traffic shifts where customers crowded in and tips flowed like a waterfall. The yellow light reflected on their faces, making their smiles even more painful, the smiles of those who knew they'd been chosen beforehand, favored over others. His heart sank when he turned back to look at Lily. She stood there, her hands trembling as she carried a plate of freshly baked toast. The yellow light spilled onto her messy hair, and her eyes seemed to burst in the darkness of injustice. He knew she was working tirelessly, hoping that one day everything would change, but her voice that morning still echoed in his ears. "Tips here, just enough to keep us hungry." A sentence that felt like a dagger straight into his heart. For a moment, Michael caught a glimpse of Lily, clumsily hiding small pieces of paper in a drawer, pieces of paper where she had carefully written down each tip that had disappeared, each threatening message from the manager, those who dared to question. He imagined those small hands trembling as she set her pen down, her panicked eyes darting around the cafe like a thief in night, terrified of being caught. Each stroke of her pen felt like a blade carving into his faith in Food Court Cafe, a place he had once built on trust and integrity. Michael leaned back in his chair, his eyes heavy with the weight of the world. Every breath he took seemed to blend with the sighs of the young people who had once called this place their second home. He could hear his heartbeat, each beat like a silent scream. Did I really let this happen? He knew he had put too much trust in the POS system, the very system that had once been his pride, the symbol of transparency and fairness. But now it has become a tool for a few to steal the hard work of vulnerable employees. Michael saw it clearly. This was no longer a battle with a fraudulent POS, but a battle to win back the trust that had been betrayed. Under the yellow light, the crow's feet around his eyes seemed to deepen marks of the sleepless nights spent pondering the dream of fairness. A dream he had once believed could be restored with just one right decision, with just one click could bring everything back to life. Michael exhaled slowly, his eyes resting on Lily. In her eyes, he saw all the employees who had once stood behind the bar, who had sweated to make this cafe a home. And he knew just one small change, one decisive action, could rekindle the flame of hope, returning everything to the value he had built with all his heart. Michael lifted his head, his eyes burned with determination. In that moment, he thought to himself, "It's time for me to stand up to restore justice for the sweat that has fallen here." Amid the bustling chatter of peak hours, Michael Foster stood up. The wooden chair behind him creaked softly like a warning bell. The warm yellow light from the ceiling spilled across his face, the face of a founder who had once poured his whole heart into building Food Court Cafe as a second home for so many people. Every crow's foot at the corner of his eyes marked the years of sacrifice. The sleepless nights were spent forging trust and fairness. But today, those eyes no longer held the gentle look of a kind father. Instead, they burned with a fierce, unyielding flame, the eyes of a man reclaiming justice for his brainchild. He raised a stack of evidence, a fragile set of pages heavy as stone, each marked with tips that had been tampered with, rigged schedules, and threatening messages to vulnerable employees. The yellow light illuminated every word on those pages, making them stand out like knives cutting straight into the heart of deceit. In that moment, every gaze in the cafe was caught, and all the chatter was swallowed by a thick, suffocating silence. His voice rang out deep but strong, each word like a hammer blow against the wall of injustice that group of managers had built over time. This is your sweat and tears stolen by those very managers. From today, every single tip will go to the one who truly deserves it. The cafe seemed to freeze. Eyes full of disbelief turned to him, then to the group of managers standing by the POS. One of them bowed his head and trembled his shoulders, shaking like a leaf in the wind. The green light from the POS screen revealing beads of sweat rolling down his temple. Sweat born of shame, of someone exposed by the truth. His fingers clutched the edge of the counter, his eyes were frantic, as if looking for a place to hide from the light of justice flooding every corner. Michael turned his gaze to Lily. That young woman, the one who had stood by his table earlier, her eyes were tired as she placed the toast, now raised her head, her eyes shimmering with tears. But these were no longer tears of fear and despair, but of a trust reborn. The yellow light shone on her face, turning her into a beacon of hope for all who had stood in the darkness, waiting for the day justice would finally be called by its true name. In that moment, Michael felt his heart pounding in sync with the breaths of everyone in the cafe, those who had once called this place their second home. He knew then justice was not just in the pages or the numbers on tips, but in the hearts of the people. There is a hope to take back hope. And he knew just one decision, just one click, could make Food Court Cafe once again the fair home he had built with all his heart. A spoon clinked softly on the table. It's small, but enough to remind Michael of the mornings long ago, when he himself would make each coffee and ask each employee how they were. His eyes are full of kindness, That look was still there, but now it carried an undertone of anger and determination of a father standing in a kitchen filled with the smell of coffee, surrounded by dozens of bowed heads and hundreds of eyes watching him. The sound of the POS beeped this time, not as the lifeless sound of an electronic device, but as the final warning for those who had manipulated it to exploit the workers who toiled every day. The green light from the screen shone on the manager's face, the one who had just bowed his head under Michael's burning gaze, making the sweat on his forehead glisten like bleeding wounds. He swallowed hard, his shoulders were trembling, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape, but there was no way out anymore. The yellow light from the ceiling illuminated his hands trembling on the keyboard, each finger clawing at the counter, as if to dig in and cling to the last bit of power. Michael tightened his grip on the stack of papers in his hand, papers that had yellowed from the sweat and tears of people like Lily. His eyes swept across each employee, each customer, as if to embrace them all in the arms of a founder who had once seen this place as a second home. He remembered Lily's eyes that morning, eyes that had once shone with hope, but were now filled with resentment, eyes of a person who had gritted her teeth, working during the lowest shifts, eyes of a person who had found the courage to write down the things no one else dared to speak aloud. Michael took a deep breath, his voice lowering, but each word thundered like lightning, shaking every breath in the cafe. They've turned this place into a stage for greed, where fairness is twisted to serve privilege. But today it's all of you who will bring fairness back. A young employee at the corner of the counter burst into tears. That tear fell on the dark wooden table, blending with the sweat that had collected there over countless long shifts. The yellow light shone on his face, revealing tearful eyes, eyes that saw trust finally called by its true name. The colleagues around him looked at Michael, their eyes gradually lighting up. The eyes of those who had once called this place a second home. Lily stood tall, her eyes sparkling with the light of a new hope. Michael looked at her, seeing himself in her from those early days, when he had once trembled as he shared each fair tip, believing that fairness could nurture trust and sow seeds of hope. Now she, Lily, was the living proof of that. That's just one decision, just one tear not left to dry, could change everything. Michael raised the stack of papers once more, his voice is stronger than ever. I will not let anyone, no one shed another tear because their tips were stolen. The rushed breaths around the cafe merged with the thunder roaring in his heart. In that moment, Food Court Cafe, a place once twisted by greed and deceit, was reignited by the flame of Michael himself, of Lily, and of all those who still believed that fairness was not a luxury, but the bare minimum of a real home. That morning, the yellow light streamed through every window pane, shining down on the Food Court Cafe, where everything was changing. Lily, the young waitress who had once nervously placed the toast in front of Michael, now stood at the bar in her new manager uniform, her eyes shining with a rare pride. The smile on her lips glowed like the dawn's first light, making all the worries of past days seem to vanish. Michael stood silently, watching her guide the new employee. Every gentle gesture, every careful explanation. The yellow light shone on her face, a face that had weathered storms, a face that had turned her own tears into strength. In that moment, Michael understood. Sometimes just a small change is enough to save an entire system. He suddenly remembered just one click on the POS, a small button to restore tips transparency, a short meeting to explain to employees how to distribute tips fairly, and a small sign placed at the register to explain to customers the importance of tipping. All of those things were so simple, so easy to implement in a single day. And just that one small change was enough to bring back the hues of hope that had long faded. Now the young employees, those who once had to skip meals, who once scavenged leftover toast to stave off hunger, could finally hold their heads high and smile at the end of their shift. Their laughter rang out like the cafe's morning bell, pouring a sense of trust into everyone's heart, a sense that this was a decent workplace where fairness was no longer an empty slogan, but the heartbeat in every glance, every drop of sweat of every person. Michael took a deep breath, his eyes glistening with pride as he looked at Lily, that young woman, now a symbol of resilience and fairness. In the warm yellow light, he thought to himself, one single tear changed an entire system. How many more waitresses live on tips they never get? Leave a comment and share this story so that the light of fairness can continue to spread everywhere. Fairness does not lie in dry revenue reports or in cold growth indicators. It does not lie in numbers or charts that executives often boast about. Fairness, in essence, lies in how you treat the people who have poured their sweat and tears into building this place. Those who trusted you with every drop of sweat, every hopeful glance, every small tip they earned with all their dedication. That is the true foundation of a real cafe, not just a place that sells coffee, but a place that gives trust and hope to every person behind the counter.